Racist cops arrested a black man, but when they discovered he was a judge, they were utterly shocked. Have you ever witnessed a moment where prejudice and power clashed so dramatically it left everyone speechless? This is the story of one such moment, a single arrest that exposed systemic bias and set the stage for a fight for justice. Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Silver Springs was a city alive with energy. Its downtown buzzed with activity, where modernity and culture collided in vibrant chaos. Yet beneath the polished veneer of commerce and progress, there simmered a troubling truth. Silver Springs harbored a deep undercurrent of prejudice. In the very institutions meant to uphold justice, bias thrived unchecked, protected by silence and fear. Among the city's police force, two names struck both fear and resentment: Jake Bradley and Tom Carter. The pair were infamous for their sharp eyes and sharper tongues, their gaze always seeming to fixate on those who, in their estimation, didn't belong. Their definition of suspicious was painfully clear to the citizens they policed. It meant anyone whose skin color, attire, or demeanor deviated from their narrow standard of acceptability. For years, their reputations had grown like a stain on the community. Stories of baseless detentions, aggressive questioning, and casual intimidation is spread in hushed whispers. Some who had experienced their scrutiny firsthand spoke of feeling stripped of their dignity in the presence of these officers. "They just decide you're guilty," one local murmured bitterly, "and then make up the reasons afterward." Yet despite the murmurs, most residents chose discretion over confrontation. Fear of retaliation kept complaints locked behind tight lips. Bradley and Carter operated with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, emboldened by a system that seemed designed to protect them. Each new shift brought another opportunity to flex their authority, each patrol a chance to remind the city who held power. On more than one occasion, their exploits were met with uncomfortable glances from their fellow officers. Yet no one spoke up, not when the consequences of defying the duo were all too clear. But Silver Springs was a city ripe for change, and its reckoning began on an unremarkable afternoon. The sun was high, casting sharp shadows over the bustling streets as the two officers strolled through downtown, their eyes scanning the crowd. The usual mix of commuters, tourists, and vendors painted a familiar scene. Then something, or rather, someone, caught their attention. Marcus Green stepped out of a sleek black car parked near City Hall. His arrival was understated yet commanded attention. A tailored suit clung to his frame, crisp and precise, accentuated by polished leather shoes that gleamed in the sunlight. His stride was measured, purposeful, and his hand gripped a worn leather briefcase as though it carried more than papers. It carried authority. His presence alone was enough to disrupt the flow of the street. To Bradley and Carter, however, it was a disruption of a different kind. "See that guy?" Carter muttered under his breath, nodding toward Marcus. Bradley followed his gaze, eyes narrowing. "Doesn't fit," he replied tersely, already slipping into their familiar pattern. Their instincts, honed by years of unchecked bias, had kicked into gear. To them, Marcus wasn't a professional man going about his day. He was a potential threat, an outsider who needed to be put in his place. The two moved in tandem, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. As they approached Marcus, Carter's hand rested instinctively on the hilt of his holstered weapon, a gesture as much about intimidation as precaution. "Sir?" Bradley called out sharply, his tone carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "Hold it right there." Marcus paused mid-step, turning slowly to face the two officers. His expression was calm but guarded, his eyes flickering with a hint of surprise before settling into an unreadable mask. "Can I help you, officers?" he asked, his voice measured and steady, betraying no trace of panic. Bradley took a step closer, his posture rigid. "We've had reports about a vehicle matching yours," he began, his voice tinged with authority, "involved in suspicious activity nearby." Carter, standing just behind his partner, added, "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, his grip tightening slightly on his briefcase. "Suspicious activity?" he echoed, his tone even. "I wasn't aware parking near City Hall was a crime. May I see the report you're referring to?" Bradley's jaw tightened at the response, irritation flashing across his face. He wasn't used to being questioned. "We ask the questions," he snapped, his voice colder now. "Hands where I can see them." A small crowd began to gather at a distance, murmurs rippling through the air as onlookers sensed the tension rising. Marcus stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. "Officers," he said firmly, "I have nothing to hide, but I would appreciate an explanation for this stop." The refusal to comply without question only seemed to enrage Bradley further. His hand moved toward his cuffs, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "You're obstructing justice," he declared. "Turn around, now!" As the cuffs clicked around Marcus's wrists, a palpable wave of unease swept through the bystanders. Several reached for their phones, capturing the scene as it unfolded. A woman in the crowd whispered, "This isn't right," but made no move to intervene. Marcus didn't resist. His movements were deliberate, his demeanor controlled even as the cold metal bit into his skin. "You're making a serious mistake," he said quietly, his tone carrying an unshakable confidence. Bradley and Carter, however, dismissed the words with a shared sneer. "Grave mistake, huh?" Carter quipped mockingly as they led Marcus toward their cruiser. "You some kind of big shot?" Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any retort, a silence that would haunt them long after the sun set on Silver Springs that day. The black sedan came to a smooth halt near City Hall, its engine purring briefly before going silent. The door opened, and Marcus Green stepped out. His suit, dark and impeccably tailored, hinted at professionalism and precision. He carried a leather briefcase, its surface worn but polished, a testament to years of diligence. His every movement was deliberate, neither rushed nor ostentatious. A man like Marcus should have blended into the urban landscape, indistinguishable from the city's lawyers, executives, or officials. But for Jake Bradley and Tom Carter, watching from across the street, Marcus stood out like a red flag. Their eyes narrowed, their instincts sharpening in the way they had grown accustomed to when someone who didn't belong crossed their path. "Who's that?" Carter muttered, his tone carrying the faint edge of suspicion. "No idea," Bradley replied, his gaze fixed. "But he's out of place." The two officers moved instinctively, weaving through the bustling sidewalk with practiced ease. Their strides quickened as they closed the gap, each step fueled by an unspoken certainty that Marcus was worth stopping. Marcus was locking his car door when Bradley's voice rang out. "Sir, stop right there!" The tone wasn't a request. It was an order, laced with an edge that demanded compliance. Marcus turned, his expression calm but wary. "Yes, officer?" he asked, his voice steady, carrying neither defiance nor submission. "We need to ask you a few questions," Carter added as he flanked Bradley, his posture tense. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his gaze flicking briefly between the two. "Is there a problem?" Bradley's eyes darted to the briefcase Marcus held. "What's in the bag?" "Documents," Marcus replied. "I'm on my way to a meeting." Carter crossed his arms, his tone thick with insinuation. "What kind of meeting?" Marcus's expression didn't falter. "A professional one, near City Hall." "Why am I being questioned?" The question seemed to irk Bradley. He stepped closer, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. "We've had reports about a car matching yours involved in a theft nearby," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Marcus's eyes widened slightly, more in disbelief than alarm. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "Do you have any evidence?" Carter took a step forward, cutting in. "We don't need evidence to ask questions. Let me see your ID." Without hesitation, Marcus reached into his pocket, moving slowly and deliberately. He retrieved his wallet and handed over his ID. Bradley snatched it, studying it with a scrutiny that felt more performative than practical. "Everything seems fine," Carter said after a glance at the ID, but his tone betrayed a reluctance to let the situation go. "Then I'd like to be on my way," Marcus said, his voice still composed. But Bradley didn't step aside. "Not so fast," he snapped. "We're not done here. Your attitude's not helping you." "My attitude?" Marcus repeated, his voice calm but tinged with incredulity. "Officers, if I'm free to leave, I will. If not, I'd like to know what I'm being detained for." The demand for clarity seemed to ignite Bradley's temper. He gestured sharply toward Marcus. "Hands where I can see them," he barked. Marcus took a deep breath, his frustration evident but contained. "This is unnecessary," he said. "It's obstruction," Bradley retorted, reaching for his cuffs. The scene unfolded rapidly. Bradley grabbed Marcus's arm, twisting it behind his back as Carter moved in to secure the other. The click of the handcuffs was loud, almost jarring, against the backdrop of murmurs from the growing crowd. "Hey, what did he do?" A woman in the crowd called out, her phone raised to capture the scene. Bradley shot her a sharp look. "Back off," he growled. Marcus, now restrained, turned his head slightly toward the woman. "Keep filming," he said quietly, his voice resolute despite the situation. "Stay out of this!" Carter barked at another bystander who had stepped closer. "Man didn't even resist," someone muttered, the tension in the air thickening. Bradley tightened his grip on Marcus's arm. "You're under arrest," he said curtly. "For what?" Marcus asked, his voice firm. "Suspicious behavior," Bradley replied without elaboration, leading him toward their cruiser. As Marcus was placed in the back seat, his calm demeanor remained intact. "You're making a mistake," he said, his tone unwavering. Carter sneered, glancing at Bradley. They always say that. The two officers climbed into the front seats, their self-satisfaction palpable. Outside, the murmurs of the crowd continued, punctuated by the occasional shout of protest. Phones were still pointed at the police car as it pulled away, carrying Marcus toward the precinct. In the rearview mirror, Bradley caught a glimpse of Marcus's reflection. There was no panic, no fear, just an unshakable resolve that unnerved him, even if he didn't yet understand why. Inside the cold, dimly lit holding cell of the Silver Springs police station, Marcus Green sat on a narrow bench, his posture calm, his gaze steady. The distant hum of ringing phones and muffled voices provided the backdrop to his silence. Across the room, Jake Bradley and Tom Carter leaned against a desk, their expressions smug. "Look at him," Carter muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Sitting there like he's better than everyone else." "Yeah," Bradley sneered, arms crossed. "Probably thinks his fancy suit makes him untouchable. Newsflash, buddy. This isn't your boardroom." Marcus didn't respond, his silence a stark contrast to their taunts. It was a silence that seemed to unnerve them more with each passing second. "You're awfully quiet," Bradley pressed, stepping closer to the cell. "What's the matter? No clever comebacks?" Marcus finally lifted his head, his voice calm yet sharp. "I don't see the point in engaging with ignorance." The remark hit its mark, and Bradley's smirk faltered for a moment before he recovered. "Big words," he shot back. "Let's see how long that composure lasts." "I'd like to make a phone call," Marcus said, his tone firm but polite. "You're not in a position to make requests," Carter interjected, his grin widening. "You think you're special. People like you always think the rules don't apply to them." "People like me?" Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. Carter chuckled darkly. "You know exactly what I mean." Bradley leaned closer to the bars. "You don't get it, do you? In here, you're nobody. We're the law." Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "Being the law doesn't mean you're above it," he said quietly. The room grew tense. Bradley's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a voice interrupted. "Is this necessary?" Emily Roberts, a young officer with wide, watchful eyes, stood hesitantly near the doorway. She had been observing the scene from a distance, her unease growing with every passing minute. Bradley turned sharply toward her. "Excuse me?" Emily hesitated but held her ground. "I'm just saying, he's not resisting. Why are we treating him like this?" Carter straightened, his tone hardening. "Careful, Roberts. You're new here. Don't start questioning how things are done." "I'm not questioning," Emily replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "I'm just wondering if this is the right way." Bradley's eyes narrowed as he stepped toward her. "Listen, rookie, this isn't some morality debate. He's in custody, and we handle things our way. Got it?" Emily's gaze flicked toward Marcus, who was watching the exchange silently. Her discomfort was evident, but she nodded reluctantly. "Good," Carter added, smirking. "Last thing we need is someone playing hero. Don't forget, you're part of this team. You don't want to be the odd one out, do you?" Emily lowered her eyes, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "No, sir." Satisfied, Bradley turned back to Marcus. "See? Even the rookie knows her place. You could learn a thing or two about that." Marcus's voice broke through the charged silence. "What kind of place is that?" he asked. "The kind where you look the other way, while injustice happens right in front of you?" Bradley glared at him. "Keep talking. It won't do you any good." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his tone measured but cutting. "You think this is power?" he said, his words directed at both officers. "Wearing a badge doesn't make you untouchable. It doesn't erase accountability." Carter let out a harsh laugh. "Accountability? Please, no one's coming to save you." Marcus's gaze didn't waver. "I don't need saving, but you might when the consequences of your actions catch up to you." Bradley rolled his eyes, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. "Spare me the lecture," he muttered, turning away. "Am I getting that phone call?" Marcus asked again, his calm persistence unwavering. "Not a chance," Carter replied dismissively. "You'll sit here until we say otherwise." In the corner, Emily shifted uncomfortably. She glanced toward the sergeant's desk, where a phone sat unused. For a moment, she seemed to consider stepping forward, but the weight of Bradley and Carter's scrutiny held her back. "Smart choice," Carter said, catching her hesitation. "Don't get involved in things you don't understand." Emily's cheeks flushed, but she remained silent. As the hours dragged on, Bradley and Carter took every opportunity to taunt Marcus, their remarks growing bolder and more offensive. But Marcus refused to rise to their provocations. His silence, his composure, it was a quiet defiance that only fueled their frustration. "You know," Bradley said at one point, leaning against the bars, "you could have made this a lot easier on yourself. A little compliance goes a long way." Marcus finally spoke, his tone razor sharp. "Compliance? You mean surrender, giving in to abuse of power? That's what you wanted, isn't it?" Bradley's face hardened, but before he could respond, the sergeant called out from across the room, Bradley, Carter, in my office. Now, the two exchanged a glance before heading toward the door, leaving Marcus alone in the cell. Emily lingered for a moment, her gaze darting toward him. You don't have to be like them, Marcus said softly, his words directed at her. Emily hesitated, her throat tightening. But instead of responding, she turned and followed the others, leaving Marcus in silence once more. Unbeknownst to anyone in the station, the videos from Marcus's arrest had already gone viral. Outside the precinct, protests were beginning to take shape. The tension that had started with Marcus's detention was now spreading through the city like wildfire. By the time Marcus Green was locked in his holding cell, the videos of his arrest had already begun to flood social media. Filmed from multiple angles, the footage captured every damning detail. The baseless accusations, the aggressive detainment, and Marcus's calm yet firm demeanor in the face of blatant injustice. Within hours, the videos were everywhere, sparking outrage across Silver Springs and beyond. The hashtags came quickly. Church of Justice for Marcus, Just End Police Bias, and Sure Accountability Now. Local activists amplified the posts, calling for immediate action. Comments poured in by the thousands, with users condemning the actions of the officers. When will this end? One post read. How many more innocent lives must be targeted before we see real change? By midday, the online furor had spilled into the streets. A growing crowd began to form outside the Silver Springs Police Department. At first, it was small, just a handful of concerned citizens holding hand-painted signs that read slogans like "Justice for All" and "Stop Racial Profiling." But as the hours passed, the crowd swelled. By evening, hundreds had gathered, their voices uniting in chants that echoed down the city streets. What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now! Inside the station, Jake Bradley and Tom Carter were oblivious to the storm brewing outside. They leaned against a desk in the precinct, laughing about the day's events. Did you see his face when we cuffed him? Bradley asked, a grin stretching across his face. Like he couldn't believe we had the guts. Carter chuckled. Yeah, he thought he was untouchable. Bet he's singing a different tune now. Meanwhile, the tension outside the station was escalating. Protesters marched with determined steps, their voices louder with every pass of a news camera. Activists took turns speaking into megaphones, their words cutting through the cold night air. We're tired of this, one woman shouted, her voice shaking with emotion. How many more of us need to be humiliated, harassed, or arrested for no reason? We will not stand for it. The crowd roared in agreement, fists raised high. But as the protest grew, so did the frustration. A smaller group of individuals, their faces obscured by scarves and hoodies, began to push against the barriers set up by the police. The officers stationed outside exchanged uneasy glances, their hands hovering near their equipment. Step back, one officer barked, his voice amplified by a megaphone. This is an unlawful gathering. Disperse immediately. The warning only fueled the crowd's anger. The chants grew louder, angrier as tensions reached a boiling point. Then suddenly, the sound of splintering wood shattered the air. A protester had thrown a piece of debris at the barricade, and the others followed suit. The police responded swiftly. A line of officers in riot gear emerged, shields raised and batons ready. The air grew thick with tension as the crowd surged forward, their voices a cacophony of outrage. Fall back, a commanding voice ordered, but the protesters stood their ground. The first canister of tear gas was fired moments later, its acrid smoke billowing into the crowd. Screams of panic erupted as people scrambled to cover their faces, their signs discarded in the chaos. Some protesters tried to help others escape the fumes, while others hurled objects at the advancing officers. Inside the station, Bradley and Carter finally took notice of the commotion. Carter peered through a window, his smirk fading as he took in the scene. What the hell is going on out there? Bradley joined him, his expression darkening. Looks like a protest, he muttered. A protest for what? Carter scoffed. Before Bradley could answer, an officer burst into the room. Bradley, Carter, you need to see this. The two followed him to the break room, where a television blared with news coverage of the protest. A reporter stood in front of the station, her voice barely audible over the chants of the crowd behind her. Outrage continues to grow over the arrest of Marcus Green, she said. The viral videos of his detainment have ignited accusations of racial profiling and police misconduct, leading to this massive demonstration outside the Silver Springs Police Department. Bradley and Carter exchanged a glance. What's the big deal? Carter asked, his tone defensive. It's just another arrest. Yeah, Bradley agreed, though there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. But the unease only deepened as the report continued. The camera cut to footage of Marcus's arrest. The scene now burned into the public's memory. The reporter's voiceover was damning. Marcus Green, a well-dressed black man, was arrested without clear evidence after being accused of suspicious behavior. The footage has sparked calls for accountability, with many questioning the officer's motives and actions. Bradley's grip on the back of the chair tightened. "They're making it sound worse than it was," he muttered. But Carter's attention was elsewhere. His eyes were fixed on the screen, where a new detail was being revealed. "Green is no ordinary citizen," the reporter continued. "Sources have identified him as Marcus Green, a respected municipal judge here in Silver Springs. The revelation has only intensified the backlash, with many arguing that even a man of his stature is not immune to systemic bias." Silence filled the break room. "A judge?" Carter finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Bradley stared at the screen, his face pale. "No way, there's no way." But the facts were undeniable. Marcus Green wasn't just another man wrongfully arrested. He was a man with power, a man who could fight back. Outside, the protest showed no signs of slowing down. The crowd's chants grew louder, their determination unwavering despite the police's attempts to control the situation. And when the truth was fully revealed, it would shake Silver Springs to its core. The air inside the holding cell was tense. Hours had passed, but Marcus Green remained composed, his calm a silent defiance against the chaos unfolding outside. Meanwhile, the precinct buzzed with murmurs about the growing protests. Officers darted back and forth, occasionally casting uneasy glances at the cell, though none dared to intervene. Finally, Marcus stood, his voice cutting through the clamor like a sharp blade. "I've asked repeatedly for a phone call," he said firmly, addressing the officer stationed at the desk nearby. "And I'm invoking my legal right to one. Are you denying it?" The officer, a burly man with a stern expression, hesitated before responding. "You'll get it when we're ready." Marcus stepped closer to the bars, his gaze steady. "You've been ready for hours," he countered. "Now I'm done waiting." The officer shifted uncomfortably, muttering something under his breath before reluctantly reaching for the phone. "Fine," he said, sliding it across the desk. "You've got 2 minutes. Make it quick." Marcus dialed a number with precision, his movements deliberate. The call connected almost immediately. "This is Marcus Green," he said. "I need you to notify my office. Tell them I've been detained at the Silver Springs precinct." The voice on the other end responded quickly, and Marcus ended the call with a simple, "Thank you." Placing the phone back on the desk, he turned to the officer. "Now, I suggest you check my records. You'll want to be thorough." The officer frowned but complied, tapping away at the keyboard. The room grew quiet as seconds ticked by, the sound of keys clicking filling the void. Then the officer froze. His eyes widened as he stared at the screen. This can't be right," he stammered, leaning closer to verify the information. "What is it?" another officer asked, stepping closer. The first officer swallowed hard. "Marcus Green," he said, his voice shaky. "He's not just anyone. He's a judge, a municipal judge." The revelation spread through the precinct like wildfire. Officers exchanged stunned glances, whispers breaking out in hushed tones. "A judge?" one of them repeated, incredulous. "Here? In Silver Springs?" Another added, disbelief etched across their face. The officer at the desk leaned back, his expression a mix of dread and realization. "Oh, we're screwed," he muttered. In the corner of the room, Jake Bradley and Tom Carter stood frozen. They had been watching from a distance, their earlier confidence now replaced with palpable unease. "Did he just say, judge?" Carter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bradley's jaw clenched. This has to be some kind of mistake, but the truth was undeniable. Marcus Green wasn't just another man. They had detained one of the most respected figures in the city's judicial system. As the weight of their actions began to sink in, Bradley marched over to the desk. "Let me see that," he demanded, gesturing toward the computer screen. The officer hesitated before turning the monitor to face him. The profile was clear. Marcus Green, Justice of the Municipal Court of Silver Springs. Below the title were details of his years of service, his accolades, and his spotless reputation. Carter peered over Bradley's shoulder, his face pale. "This can't be happening," he muttered. "This is bad. Really bad." "It's not just bad," the officer at the desk interjected. It's a disaster. You two arrested a sitting judge. Bradley's face darkened. So what? He was acting suspicious. That doesn't change anything. But the officer shook his head. It changes everything. This isn't just some random guy you can intimidate. He knows the law better than any of us. And if he decides to fight this, the sentence hung in the air, unfinished but heavy with implication. Carter paced nervously. What do we do? He asked, his voice rising. If this gets out, it's already out, another officer interrupted, holding up his phone. The videos are everywhere. The protests outside, they're all for him. Bradley slammed his fist on the desk, his frustration boiling over. Damn it, he snapped. How did this spiral out of control? Marcus, still standing in his cell, watched the chaos unfold with quiet intensity. His silence was not passive, it was deliberate, a calculated response that only heightened the tension. Finally he spoke, his voice calm yet cutting. I told you, he said, addressing Bradley and Carter directly. You're making a mistake, and now you're realizing just how grave it is. Bradley spun around, his expression livid. Don't act like you've won, he growled. This isn't over. No, Marcus replied evenly. It's just beginning. At that moment, the station door opened, and a high-ranking official strode in, flanked by two assistants. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look. The official's gaze swept across the room before settling on Marcus. Judge Green, he said, addressing him formally. I've been informed of your situation. Rest assured, this matter is being escalated. Bradley stepped forward, his tone defensive. Sir, we were just doing our job. Enough, the official interrupted sharply. I don't want to hear excuses. You've arrested a sitting judge without probable cause. Do you have any idea the kind of scandal this will create? Bradley opened his mouth to respond but thought better of it, falling silent instead. The official turned back to Marcus. Your release is being processed, he said. I deeply apologize for this oversight. Marcus inclined his head slightly. Apologies are noted, he said, but they won't be enough. The tension in the room was suffocating as the official left to finalize the paperwork. Bradley and Carter remained rooted in place, their confidence shattered. What now? Carter whispered. Bradley didn't answer. For the first time, he had no idea what to do. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the air thick with anticipation. Journalists, activists, and local residents filled every available seat, their eyes fixed on the bench where the drama was about to unfold. Outside, protesters chanted relentlessly, their voices reverberating even through the courtroom's thick walls. The arrest of Marcus Green, a sitting judge, had become a flashpoint in the city, and now the entire community had gathered to witness the fallout. The doors opened, and Marcus entered. Dressed in his judicial robe, he exuded authority with every step. His expression was calm but resolute, a stark reminder of the power he wielded, not as a victim, but as a man of the law. The room fell silent as he approached the bench, his presence commanding attention without a single word. At the defense table sat Jake Bradley and Tom Carter, flanked by their lawyer, Ethan Caldwell, a renowned defense attorney known for his ruthless tactics. Gone was the bravado that the two officers had displayed during the arrest. Now they sat stiffly, their faces pale, avoiding eye contact with the crowd and, most importantly, with Marcus. All rise, the bailiff announced, and everyone in the courtroom stood. Marcus took his seat at the bench, his gaze sweeping across the room before settling on Bradley and Carter. You may be seated, he said, his voice steady, betraying no emotion. The prosecution began by playing the now viral videos of Marcus's arrest. The room watched in absolute silence as the footage unfolded. Bradley and Carter's baseless accusations, their aggressive demeanor, and Marcus's calm compliance. The scenes were damning, each frame a testament to the abuse of power that had ignited the community's outrage. When the video ended, the prosecutor turned to the courtroom. This, she said firmly, is what systemic bias looks like. Two officers, emboldened by their authority, targeted a man without cause. Not just any man, a judge, a man who has dedicated his life to upholding the very laws they swore to protect. Caldwell rose to his feet, his polished demeanor a stark contrast to the tension in the room. Your Honor, he began, while the videos may seem incriminating, I urge the court to consider the context. Officers Bradley and Carter acted in good faith, responding to what they believed was suspicious behavior. This was not an act of malice, it was a judgment call. Marcus's eyes remained fixed on Caldwell, his expression unreadable. The defense called Bradley to the stand first. Taking a deep breath, he adjusted his tie and sat down, visibly uneasy under the scrutiny of the room. "Officer Bradley," Caldwell began, "can you explain why you approached Mr. Green that day?" Bradley cleared his throat. "We received a report about a car matching his vehicle's description being involved in suspicious activity. When we saw him near City Hall, we believed it was our duty to investigate." Caldwell nodded. "And did Mr. Green cooperate with your questions?" "He was evasive," Bradley said, his words slow and deliberate. The prosecutor immediately stood. "Objection. The video clearly shows Judge Green complying with every instruction." "Sustained," Marcus said, his voice firm. Bradley shifted uncomfortably. Caldwell pressed on, but the cracks in the defense were becoming more apparent. The prosecution methodically dismantled each point, using the footage and witness testimonies to expose inconsistencies in Bradley and Carter's accounts. When Carter took the stand, his demeanor was even more defensive. "We were just doing our job," he insisted, but his tone lacked conviction. "Your job?" the prosecutor countered during cross-examination. "Was it your job to fabricate accusations? To arrest a man without evidence?" Carter faltered. We believed we had cause." "Believed," the prosecutor repeated, her tone sharp. "And when you realized you didn't, what did you do? You doubled down. You refused him a phone call, mocked him, and ignored every sign that you were wrong." The courtroom murmured in agreement, the weight of the evidence impossible to ignore. Caldwell attempted to regain control. "Your Honor, police work often involves split-second decisions." "Spare me the platitudes, Mr. Caldwell," Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This wasn't a split-second decision. This was a calculated misuse of authority." The courtroom fell silent again. Caldwell sat down, momentarily at a loss for words. When the defense rested, Marcus addressed the court directly. His words were measured but laced with restrained anger. "Officers Bradley and Carter," he began, his gaze piercing, "your actions on that day were not just an attack on me as an individual, they were an attack on the integrity of the law. You acted not as protectors of the community, but as enforcers of your own biases. Your behavior didn't just harm me, it fractured the trust that the public places in the justice system." Bradley and Carter shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet his eyes. "Justice," Marcus continued, his voice rising slightly, "is built on the foundation of accountability. Without it, the law becomes meaningless. Today, you stand accused not just of misconduct, but of betraying the very ideals you swore to uphold." The crowd in the gallery leaned forward, hanging on his every word. Marcus paused, letting the weight of his statement settle. "The law will decide your fate, as it should. But let this serve as a reminder. Authority is not a shield for wrongdoing. It is a responsibility you failed to honor." With that, he ended the session for the day, his gavel striking with finality. The crowd erupted into whispers, the tension in the room finally breaking. As Bradley and Carter were escorted out, their faces pale and drawn, it was clear that their confidence had been shattered. The courtroom, once their domain of control, had become a place where they were stripped of their power and exposed for who they truly were. The courtroom was silent as the judge entered to deliver the final verdict. All eyes were on Jake Bradley and Tom Carter, seated at the defense table. Their expressions, once smug and defiant, had withered under the weight of days of testimony, damning evidence, and public outrage. As they awaited their fate, the tension in the air was suffocating. Marcus Green, in his judicial robe, addressed the room. His tone was firm, measured, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had been wronged and sought accountability. "The court has reviewed all evidence presented, including the video footage, witness testimonies, and the defendant's own statements," Marcus began. His words were clear and deliberate, each syllable landing like a hammer on an anvil. "Officers Jake Bradley and Tom Carter," he continued, turning his gaze directly to the two men, "this court finds your actions to be a gross violation of protocol and an abuse of the authority entrusted to you by this community. Your behavior undermined not only the rights of the individual you detained, but also the public's trust in law enforcement as a whole." Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. Carter avoided eye contact entirely, staring blankly at the table in front of him. As a result, Marcus declared, his voice unwavering, you are hereby suspended without pay pending further investigation. Additionally, you are required to issue a public apology to the community for your actions. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The consequences were severe, though some in the gallery whispered that they weren't severe enough. The prosecutor stood, addressing the judge. Your Honor, we also request a comprehensive review of the defendant's past cases to identify any potential patterns of misconduct. Marcus nodded. Granted. A full internal investigation will be conducted. Any evidence of wrongdoing uncovered in their past actions will be met with the appropriate legal response. Bradley's face turned red with anger. This is a witch hunt, he snapped, rising to his feet. We were just doing our job. Sit down, Officer Bradley, Marcus commanded sharply, his voice cutting through the room. Your inability to acknowledge the harm you've caused only reinforces the necessity of this decision. Bradley reluctantly sat back down, his fists clenched. Carter finally spoke, his voice shaky. We didn't mean for it to go this far, he muttered. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Intent does not absolve you of accountability. You had ample opportunity to correct your actions, yet you chose to double down instead. With that, Marcus struck the gavel. This court is adjourned. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate. Protesters who had been waiting for hours erupted into chants of victory, their voices echoing through the streets. Justice for Marcus, they cried, holding signs high in the air. The case had become more than one man's fight. It was a symbol of the community's demand for accountability and reform. As Bradley and Carter exited the courthouse flanked by their lawyer, they were met with a barrage of questions from reporters. Do you have any comment on the verdict? One journalist called out. Do you regret your actions? Another pressed. Bradley scowled, brushing past the cameras without a word. Carter followed, his head bowed, mumbling something incoherent. Their lawyer, Ethan Caldwell, attempted to shield them from the onslaught, but it was clear their reputations were in tatters. Back inside the precinct, the fallout was just beginning. The announcement of the investigation into Bradley and Carter's past conduct sent shockwaves through the department. Officers whispered among themselves, some defending their colleagues, others quietly admitting that the two had long been a problem. They've always pushed the limits, one officer remarked to another, but now it's catching up to them. An internal review quickly uncovered disturbing patterns. Bradley and Carter had been the subject of multiple complaints over the years. Allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and unprofessional behavior. Most of these complaints had been dismissed without proper investigation, buried under bureaucratic red tape. A senior officer, clearly rattled, addressed the precinct staff. This isn't just about two bad cops, he admitted grimly. This is about a culture that allowed it to happen, and it's on all of us to fix it. The revelation sparked a broader crisis within the department. Community leaders demanded transparency, calling for independent oversight of police misconduct cases. City officials scrambled to contain the damage, issuing public statements and promises of reform. At the center of it all was Marcus Green. While the verdict against Bradley and Carter was a step forward, he knew it was only the beginning. The cracks in the system had been exposed, and now it was time to rebuild. In a press conference the following day, Marcus stood before a sea of reporters and activists. His voice was calm but resolute as he addressed the crowd. This case was never just about me, he began. It was about the systemic issues that allow abuse of power to thrive unchecked. Today, we've taken the first step toward accountability. But let me be clear, this is not the end. It is only the beginning. He outlined a plan to work with city officials and law enforcement leaders to implement reforms. Mandatory bias training, increased transparency in misconduct investigations, and stronger community oversight. The trust between law enforcement and the people they serve is fragile, Marcus said, his voice rising with conviction. It must be earned and it must be protected. This is how we move forward, together. The crowd erupted in applause, their energy a testament to the momentum the case had created. Back at the precinct, Bradley and Carter sat in the locker room, the weight of their suspension hanging over them. This is all blown out of proportion, Bradley muttered bitterly. They're using us as scapegoats. Carter didn't respond. For once, he seemed to grasp the gravity of their situation. They're not just coming for us, he finally said. They're coming for everyone who let this happen. Bradley didn't reply. The truth was unavoidable. Their actions had set off a chain reaction that was far beyond their control. Marcus Green wasted no time after the courtroom's verdict. With the public's trust and a mandate for change, he convened a meeting with Silver Spring's top officials. The agenda was clear: dismantle the culture of bias and abuse within the police department and replace it with accountability and integrity. The room was filled with tension. City council members, police leadership, and community advocates all had their own stakes in the discussion. Marcus, at the head of the table, opened the meeting with his signature, calm but unyielding tone. "We've seen what happens when power goes unchecked," he began, his voice resolute. "It erodes trust and undermines justice. This city deserves a police force that serves and protects, not one that intimidates and discriminates." His proposals were comprehensive: mandatory bias training, the creation of an independent oversight committee to review misconduct, increased transparency in officer complaints, and a zero-tolerance policy for violations. As Marcus outlined his vision, heads nodded among community leaders and council members. But across the table, there were signs of resistance. Captain Richard Hayes, a veteran officer with over 2 decades of service, leaned forward, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Judge Green, I respect your intentions," he began, "but you're asking us to upend an entire system. Policies like this paint all officers as the enemy. It's demoralizing for those of us who've spent our careers doing the right thing." Marcus met Hayes's gaze evenly. "Captain Hayes, if the system was working as intended, we wouldn't be here. Good officers have nothing to fear from accountability. Only those who abuse their power should feel threatened." Hayes's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Resistance within the department wasn't limited to the meeting room. As news of the proposed reforms spread, murmurs of dissent grew louder among the rank and file. Some officers viewed the changes as a direct attack on their profession, a betrayal from city leadership bowing to public pressure. "First they hang Bradley and Carter out to dry," one officer grumbled in the locker room. "Now they want to treat us all like criminals." "Yeah," another agreed. "Who's going to want to do this job if we're under a microscope all the time?" But not all voices in the department echoed these sentiments. Emily Roberts, the young officer who had witnessed Bradley and Carter's actions firsthand, spoke cautiously during a shift briefing. "Maybe this is what we need," she said, her voice hesitant but steady. "If we're doing our jobs right, these reforms shouldn't scare us. They should help us." Her words were met with a mix of nods and scowls. Sergeant Daniels, her direct superior, shot her a sharp look. "Watch yourself, Roberts," he warned. "You don't want to alienate your colleagues." But Emily refused to back down. "I just think the community deserves to feel safe when they see us," she said. "That shouldn't be controversial." While some officers voiced their concerns openly, others took a more covert approach. Behind closed doors, a small group of disgruntled officers met in secret, venting their frustrations and plotting ways to undermine Marcus's efforts. "He's making us look weak," one officer growled, slamming his fist on the table. "We need to push back before he tears this department apart." Another officer chimed in. "What if we start leaking stories about him? Dig into his past, find something to discredit him?" The group agreed to dig up whatever dirt they could find. It was a desperate act of self-preservation, but in their minds it was justified. Meanwhile, Marcus remained steadfast. He continued meeting with community leaders, holding town halls to ensure the public's voice was central to the reform process. At one such event, a heated exchange captured the intensity of the moment. A man in the audience stood up, his voice loud and confrontational. "Judge Green, you're turning this city into a circus. These officers risk their lives every day, and you're treating them like criminals." Marcus didn't flinch. "Sir," he replied evenly, "this isn't about punishing officers. It's about ensuring that those who wear the badge honor the responsibility it carries. Accountability is not the enemy of good policing. It's its foundation." The man started to retort, but a woman next to him cut him off. "Maybe if people like Bradley and Carter had been held accountable sooner, this city wouldn't be in this mess," she said firmly. The audience erupted into applause, and the man sat down, grumbling under his breath. Despite the mounting pressure, Marcus pressed forward. He convened a joint session with city officials and police leadership to finalize the reforms. The negotiations were tense, with Hayes and other senior officers continuing to push back on several proposals. "You're setting us up for failure," Hayes argued during one particularly heated moment. "These committees you're talking about, outsiders who don't understand the realities of police work, are going to second-guess every decision we make." Marcus leaned forward, his voice calm but unyielding. "Captain Hayes, the reality of police work should never include unchecked power or prejudice. If an officer's decisions can't stand up to scrutiny, then they're not decisions that should have been made." The room fell silent. Even Hayes had no response to that. The turning point came when Marcus received unexpected support from Chief Franklin, the head of the police department. Franklin had remained largely silent during the reform discussions, but in the final meeting he spoke up. "I'll admit I was skeptical at first," Franklin said, addressing the room. "But after seeing the public's reaction to recent events, I realize these changes aren't just necessary, they're overdue. If we don't take this opportunity to rebuild trust, we'll lose the community entirely. And without their trust, we can't do our job." The room erupted into murmurs, but Franklin's endorsement carried weight. One by one, the remaining holdouts reluctantly agreed to move forward with the reforms. As the new policies were implemented, the department began to change. Bias training sessions were held weekly, and the Independent Oversight Committee was formed. Officers were required to wear body cameras at all times, with footage reviewed regularly. Predictably, there were growing pains. Some officers resigned in protest, while others grudgingly adapted. But as time went on, the community began to notice a difference. Complaints about misconduct decreased, and public trust in the department slowly started to rebuild. Marcus remained at the forefront, monitoring the progress and holding the department accountable. Despite the backlash and attempts to undermine him, he stayed true to his mission, bolstered by the support of a community that refused to back down. The reforms in Silver Springs quickly became a national talking point. News outlets broadcasted the story of Marcus Green and the systemic changes he spearheaded, framing it as a blueprint for accountability and justice in law enforcement. As the story gained traction, activists and community leaders across the country began demanding similar reforms in their own cities. The ripple effect was immediate. In Chicago, a coalition of civil rights organizations cited Silver Springs as inspiration while petitioning for an independent oversight committee to handle police misconduct cases. In Atlanta, grassroots groups organized marches calling for mandatory bias training for officers, using Marcus's name as a rallying cry. "If they can do it in Silver Springs," one organizer declared at a rally, "we can do it here." National politicians also took notice. Senators and representatives began debating Marcus's approach, with some proposing federal legislation to standardize practices like body cameras, external oversight, and stricter accountability measures for police departments. Marcus, however, wasn't content to let the momentum grow without his involvement. He was determined to ensure the movement stayed true to its principles. "Progress isn't just about starting a conversation," he told a room of lawmakers at a policy summit in Washington, D.C. "It's about turning that conversation into action. And action requires laws that protect the vulnerable and hold the powerful accountable." Over the following months, Marcus became a driving force behind the drafting of several bills aimed at police reform. He worked closely with legal experts, civil rights organizations, and legislators, lending his firsthand experience to their efforts. In one particularly contentious hearing, Marcus faced off against a powerful police union representative who argued that increased oversight would cripple officers' ability to perform their duty. "You're asking us to operate under impossible scrutiny," the representative said, his voice rising. "How can we protect the public if we're constantly worried about being second-guessed?" Marcus responded without hesitation. "Accountability isn't a burden, it's a necessity," he said firmly. "If your actions can't withstand scrutiny, then they aren't actions that protect the public. They're actions that betray." The room erupted into applause, drowning out the union representative's protests. Meanwhile, back in Silver Springs, the city continued to transform under the reforms Marcus had helped implement. The Independent Oversight Committee began uncovering more instances of misconduct, leading to the dismissal of several officers who had previously operated with impunity. Emily Roberts, the young officer who had once hesitated to speak out, now led community engagement initiatives aimed at rebuilding trust between the department and the public. At one town hall meeting, a resident stood up and addressed Emily directly. For years, we felt like the police were against us, the man said. But seeing officers like you take a stand, it gives us hope. Emily nodded, her voice steady. Accountability isn't just about punishment. It's about learning, growing, and becoming better. That's what we're trying to do. The shift in Silver Springs was undeniable, and it didn't go unnoticed. Other cities sent delegations to study the reforms, eager to replicate their success. Marcus often hosted these delegations, walking them through the process while emphasizing the importance of community involvement. Reform can't happen in a vacuum, he explained to a group of visiting officials from Detroit. It requires collaboration, transparency, and above all, a willingness to listen to the people most affected by these systems. As the movement spread, Marcus found himself at the center of a whirlwind. Invitations to speak poured in from universities, conferences, and advocacy groups. He traveled tirelessly, sharing his experiences and advocating for systemic change. At one particularly high-profile event in New York City, Marcus addressed a packed auditorium. His words were as powerful as they were unrelenting. Justice isn't a destination, he said. It's a continuous effort, a commitment to fairness, equity, and accountability. It's not enough to expose the flaws in our systems. We must rebuild those systems with integrity. The audience gave him a standing ovation, but Marcus remained grounded. He knew that speeches and applause were only the beginning. Real change required sustained effort. In the months that followed, the movement inspired by Marcus gained even more momentum. Several states passed legislation mirroring the reforms in Silver Springs, creating independent bodies to oversee police conduct and mandating rigorous bias training for officers. However, the pushback was equally fierce. Police unions in some cities resisted the changes, claiming they were unfairly targeted. Protests erupted in opposition to the reforms, with some accusing Marcus of vilifying law enforcement. Marcus faced the criticism head-on. In a televised interview, he addressed the backlash directly. "This isn't about vilifying anyone," he said. "It's about ensuring that the power entrusted to law enforcement is used responsibly. If we want to rebuild trust, we have to start with accountability. That's not an attack, it's a stand." Back in Silver Springs, the reforms had transformed the city into a national symbol of hope and progress. Murals of Marcus began appearing on buildings, depicting him as a figure of justice and resilience. The phrase Silver Springs Standard became synonymous with ethical policing practices, and the city's success story was studied in academic institutions across the country. At a ceremony celebrating the first graduating class of recruits trained under the new guidelines, Marcus stood before the cadets, his voice filled with both pride and determination. "You represent a new chapter," he told them. "A chapter where law enforcement and community are not adversaries but allies. Remember, accountability is not your enemy. It is your guide." The recruits applauded, their faces filled with determination. Despite the progress, Marcus knew the work was far from finished. At a press conference marking the one-year anniversary of the reforms, he addressed the crowd with a mixture of hope and caution. "We've accomplished a great deal," he said, "but let's not mistake progress for completion. There is still much to be done, not just here, but across the country. Change is never easy, but it is always worth it." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Marcus's expression remained solemn. He knew the fight for justice was a marathon, not a sprint. The reforms spearheaded by Marcus Green had created a seismic shift in Silver Springs, but not everyone embraced the change. A small faction within the police department, officers disgruntled by the increased oversight and loss of unchecked authority, began plotting to discredit Marcus. "He's tearing us apart," one officer growled during a covert meeting. "We need to remind everyone he's not as perfect as they think." Another officer leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. "I've heard rumors. Everyone has skeletons. We just need to find his and drag them into..." Their plan unfolded quickly. Fabricated stories began circulating, accusing Marcus of financial impropriety during his tenure as a judge. Anonymous tips were sent to local reporters, claiming he had bent the law to favor certain individuals. The accusations were baseless, but they spread like wildfire, feeding the narratives of those eager to see Marcus fall. News outlets picked up the claims, some presenting them as fact without verification. Social media buzzed with speculation, and detractors seized the opportunity to question Marcus's integrity. Is the man behind the reforms as clean as he claims? One headline blazed. Marcus first learned of the rumors during a late-night call from a trusted ally, Angela Myers, a journalist who had been a vocal supporter of his work. Marcus, Angela said, her tone urgent, have you seen what's being said about you? Marcus sighed. I've heard whispers, he admitted. It's worse than whispers, Angela replied. They're painting you as corrupt, and some outlets aren't even bothering to check the facts. Marcus's expression hardened. Then we'll give them the truth. Every accusation, every claim, I'll address it head on. Angela hesitated. You know they're not playing fair, right? This isn't about facts. It's about undermining everything you built. I know, Marcus said calmly, but the truth has a way of cutting through the noise. The next morning, Marcus held a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras trained on him as he stepped up to the podium. I'm aware of the allegations being made against me, Marcus began, his voice steady and unyielding. And I want to be clear, these claims are false. They are an attempt to distract from the progress we've made and to divide the community. He held up a folder. Every decision I've made as a judge, every financial record tied to my name, is here. I am making it all available for review. Transparency is not a burden. It is a responsibility. The room buzzed with murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously, some clearly surprised by Marcus's forthright. Marcus continued, his tone sharpening. But this isn't just about me. This is about the lengths some will go to in order to protect a broken system. These attacks are a desperate attempt to silence accountability and preserve the status quo. I will not allow that to happen. His words were met with applause, but the battle was far from over. Behind the scenes, Angela and a team of investigative journalists worked tirelessly to trace the source of the false allegations. Through meticulous digging, they uncovered a series of anonymous emails sent to media outlets. The emails originated from within the Silver Springs Police Department. The revelation was explosive. Angela broke the story first, detailing how a small group of officers had orchestrated the smear campaign. The evidence was damning. Emails, internal memos, and even recorded conversations that revealed their intent to discredit Marcus and derail the reform. Public outrage was immediate and fierce. The officers involved were identified, suspended, and placed under investigation. At another press conference, Marcus addressed the developments with his characteristic composure. The actions of these individuals do not reflect the values of the Silver Springs Police Department as a whole, he said, but their behavior highlights why these reforms are necessary. Accountability is not optional. It is a... Reporters pressed him for comment on how he felt about being targeted. Marcus paused before responding. They tried to tear me down because I represented change, he said, but change isn't about one person. It's about all of us demanding better from our institutions, from our leaders, and from ourselves. If this experience has taught me anything, it's that the fight for justice is never easy, but it is always. The fallout from the scandal only strengthened Marcus's position. Community leaders rallied around him, organizing events to show their support. Social media buzzed with hashtags like Soccer's Stand with Marcus and Nashan, Truth Prevails. Even some of Marcus's critics admitted that the transparency with which he handled the situation was commendable. The smear campaign intended to weaken him had only made him. In the weeks that followed, Marcus doubled down on his efforts. He worked tirelessly with city officials to ensure that the officers responsible for the smear campaign were held accountable and that additional safeguards were put in place to prevent similar abuses. At a community forum, a young woman stood up and addressed Marcus. I was starting to lose hope, she said, her voice trembling. But seeing how you handled this, it reminded me that there are still people fighting for what's right. Thank you. Marcus nodded, his expression soft. Hope isn't something we find, he replied. It's something we create. The ordeal had tested Marcus's resolve, but it had also reaffirmed his commitment to the cause. And with the truth firmly on his side, Marcus prepared to step forward once again, ready to deliver a message of hope and determination to all who would. The steps of City Hall were packed with people, the plaza below brimming with anticipation. Men, women, and children of all backgrounds stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed on the makeshift podium erected at the top of the steps. The crowd stretched as far as the eye could see, a living testament to the movement that had grown far beyond Silver Spring. When Marcus Green stepped onto the stage, a wave of cheers erupted. The applause was deafening, but Marcus raised a hand, signaling for quiet. Slowly the noise subsided, replaced by a silence charged with expectation. Marcus gripped the edges of the podium and surveyed the sea of faces before him. His voice, steady yet impassioned, cut through the air. "When I first became a judge," he began, "I believed that the law was the great equalizer, that justice would prevail if we simply followed the rules. But my own experience taught me a hard truth. The rules are only as fair as the people who enforce them." The crowd remained silent, hanging on to his every word. "My arrest," Marcus continued, "was not an isolated incident. It was the result of a system that too often allows bias to dictate action, that protects power at the expense of accountability. And while I stood before you as a victim that day, I stand before you now as a man determined to bring change, not just for myself, but for every single person who has been wronged by that." A ripple of applause broke out but quickly died down as Marcus pressed on. "Justice is not a privilege," he declared. "It is a right. It is not something that should be rationed out to a select few. It belongs to all of us, regardless of race, class, or..." The crowd erupted in agreement, cheers and chants of "Justice for all" punctuating his. Marcus waited for the noise to subside before continuing, his voice rising with "We've come a long way, but let me be clear. The work is far from done. Change doesn't come easy. It requires us to confront uncomfortable truths, to challenge systems that have existed for generations. It requires courage, not just from those in power, but from every single one of you standing here." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "You are the reason we've come this far. Your voices, your determination, your refusal to accept the status quo. This movement isn't about one person. It's about all of us, standing together, demanding better, and refusing to back." Marcus's words began to shift, becoming more personal. "I was raised to believe in fairness," he said. "My parents taught me that integrity matters, that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. When I was handcuffed on that street, those lessons gave me the strength to remain calm. They reminded me that dignity can't be taken away by a badge or a uniform. It's something no one can strip from you unless you let them." His voice broke slightly, but he quickly recovered. "I'm sharing this because I want every person here to know that your voice matters. Your actions matter. Whether you're marching in the streets, speaking out at town halls, or simply treating your neighbor with kindness, every effort counts. Together, we are stronger than any system of oppression." The crowd's energy shifted, becoming electric. People began chanting, their voices uniting in a powerful refrain. "We stand together! We fight together!" Marcus raised his voice to be heard over the chants. "Together we are unstoppable. Together we can build a world where justice is not an uphill battle, but the foundation upon which we all..." The words struck a chord, rippling through the crowd like a wave. People held up signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Accountability now." Tears streamed down the faces of some in the audience, their emotions spilling over as Marcus's words gave voice to their shared struggle. As the speech neared its conclusion, Marcus's tone became quieter, but no less powerful. "Let this moment remind us," he said, "that change is possible. It starts with a spark, but it grows into a fire when people come together. This is not the end of our journey. It is just the beginning. There will be resistance, there will be setbacks, but as long as we stand united, we can overcome anything." He stepped back from the podium slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Justice is for everyone, and today we reaffirm our commitment to that truth. We will not stop, we will not be silenced, and we will not..." Marcus raised a fist in the air, and the crowd exploded in applause and cheers. The chant began again, louder this time. "Justice for all! Justice for..." As the crowd's chants echoed through the city, Marcus stepped down from the podium. He was met by a group of young activists who had been inspired by his work. One of them, a teenage girl holding a handmade sign. "Mr. Green," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "thank you for fighting for us. You've shown us that we have power too." Marcus smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. The power was always he said. I'm just here to remind you how to. The rally lasted for hours, the energy refusing to fade even as the sun set. Marcus watched from a distance, his heart filled with a mixture of pride and determination. The movement had grown beyond him, and he knew it was now in the hands of the people. The graduation ceremony for the latest class of police recruits was held under clear skies on the training academy's main grounds. The cadets, standing in crisp uniforms, formed neat rows as they awaited their official induction into the. Each one represented a new vision of law enforcement, one shaped by accountability, empathy, and justice. From the sidelines, Marcus Green watched silently. His arms were crossed, his expression a mixture of pride and determination. These recruits had undergone rigorous training that emphasized not only tactical skills but also ethical conduct, de-escalation techniques, and community engagement. They were a symbol of the reforms Marcus had fought so hard to. The academy director stepped up to the microphone, delivering a speech about the cadets' accomplishments and the challenges that lay ahead. But it was the moment when a young recruit stepped forward to address the crowd that truly captured Marcus's attention. "We're not just here to enforce the law," the recruit said, her voice clear and confident. "We're here to serve the people, to build trust where it's been broken, and to ensure that justice isn't just a word, it's a reality." The audience erupted into applause, but Marcus's gaze lingered on the cadets. He saw something in their faces he hadn't seen before, a sense of purpose rooted in integrity. After the ceremony, Marcus walked through the crowd, shaking hands with graduates and their families. One young recruit approached him hesitantly. "Judge Green," the recruit began, his voice tinged with nervousness, "I just wanted to say thank you. My father told me about what happened here, how you stood up when no one else would. It's why I joined the." Marcus smiled, placing a hand on the recruit's shoulder. "It's not about standing up once," he said. "It's about standing up every day, even when it's hard." The recruit nodded, his resolve evident. Despite the progress on display, Marcus knew the fight wasn't over. Silver Springs had become a beacon for reform, but other cities still lagged behind. Resistance to change remained fierce in many places, with some clinging to outdated systems and ideologies. During a meeting with city officials later that week, Marcus addressed the challenges ahead. "We built a foundation here," he said, "but a foundation is only the beginning. We need to expand these reforms, ensure they're lasting, and show other cities that progress is possible. That means vigilance. That means persistence." The mayor, seated at the head of the table, nodded. "Your work has inspired a lot of people, Marcus, but it's also put a target on your back. Are you prepared for what comes?" Marcus's response was immediate. "Change always comes at a cost," he said, "but the cost of doing nothing is far." Weeks turned into months, and the impact of Marcus's efforts continued to grow. Crime rates in Silver Springs began to decline, not just because of stricter enforcement, but because of the trust that had been rebuilt between the community and law enforcement. Citizens felt safer reporting crimes, knowing their voices would be heard without. One afternoon, Marcus attended a town hall meeting where community members shared their thoughts on the progress being made. A local shop owner stood up, her voice filled with emotion. "For the first time in years, I feel like I can call the police without fear," she said. "That's because of the work you've done, Judge Green." The room erupted into applause, but Marcus raised a hand, signaling for quiet. "This isn't just my work," he said. "It's ours. Change doesn't happen because of one person. It happens when communities come together, demand better, and refuse to back down. Don't stop pushing for progress. Don't stop holding us." Despite the successes, Marcus remained grounded. He often reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The wrongful arrest, the courtroom battles, the smear campaigns. Each moment of adversity had tested his resolve, but had also strengthened it. One evening, as he walked through the streets of Silver Springs, he stopped in front of a mural painted on the side of a building. It depicted a diverse group of people standing together, their arms linked with the words "Justice for All" emblazoned. A young girl tugged at her mother's hand nearby, pointing at the mural. "Mom, is that what Mr. Green talks about?" Her mother smiled. "Yes, sweetheart. That's what he's." Marcus's lips curved into a faint smile as he overheard the exchange. On the one-year anniversary of the reform's implementation, Marcus stood once again on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd. The plaza was just as packed as it had been the day of his pivotal speech, but this time, the atmosphere was lighter, filled with a sense of accomplishment. We've come a long way, Marcus began, his voice steady, but the work of justice is never finished. Every generation must carry this torch, not just to preserve what has been built, but to create something even. He paused, letting the words sink in. We've shown that change is possible, that a system can evolve, but it takes all of us, working together, holding each other accountable, and never losing sight of what we're. The crowd cheered, their voices echoing through the city. As Marcus stepped back from the podium, he allowed himself a rare moment of quiet reflection. He looked out over the crowd, faces filled with hope and determination, and felt a profound sense of pride. Later that evening, Marcus stood alone on the steps of City Hall, watching the sunset. The city below buzzed with life, its streets illuminated by the warm glow of streetlights. He thought about the journey that lay ahead, the obstacles that would undoubtedly arise, and the people who would continue the work long after he was gone. Justice, he realized, wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one that required constant effort and unwavering resolve. With a faint smile, he murmured to himself, "Justice will always be the foundation of a fair society." And with that, he turned and walked into the night, ready to face whatever came next. The story of Marcus Green is a testament to the power of resilience, accountability, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. From being wrongfully arrested to leading a nationwide movement for reform, Marcus proved that change begins with courage and grows through collective action. His journey reminds us that even in the face of adversity, one voice can ignite a chorus of hope. But the question remains, what role will you play in the fight for justice and equality? Change doesn't happen without the support of people like you, those willing to stand up, speak out, and demand better from the systems that govern our lives. If this story inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge, empower, and inspire. Together, we can make a difference.
The sun was still rising over Atlanta as Judge Michelle Carter adjusted her hat and stepped out of her car, parked on a cracked curb in the neighborhood she'd grown up in. Wearing her favorite faded denim jacket and a pair of sneakers, she felt a strange mix of nostalgia and melancholy as she walked the familiar streets of her childhood. The corner store where she and her friends used to buy candy was still standing, though now it boasted a bold red "For Lease" sign in the window. The vibrant mural on the side of the building, depicting a young black girl reading a book, had faded under years of neglect. Michelle breathed deeply, letting the sharp morning air ground her. It had been years since she'd taken time to walk these streets, and for once, she wasn't Judge Carter, the woman known for her sharp rulings and fiery speeches about equality. Today, she was just Michelle, a woman trying to connect with her roots. But that connection was rudely interrupted when she stepped into the small convenience store on the corner. The store was quiet, save for the faint hum of a refrigerator in the back. Michelle grabbed a bottle of water and a granola bar, her mind wandering. She was so lost in thought that she barely noticed the cashier, a wiry young man, watching her every move. When she approached the counter, the cashier didn't greet her. Instead, he pressed a button below the register, his hand trembling slightly. "Is everything all right?" Michelle asked, her voice calm but slightly confused. Yeah," the cashier mumbled, avoiding her gaze. Just hold on a second." Michelle frowned but said nothing, pulling a few dollars from her pocket. Before she could hand them over, the bell above the store's door jingled sharply. Two police officers, Deputy Michael Blake, a tall man with a buzz cut, and Officer Travis Hunter, who carried a constant smirk, stepped inside, their boots heavy against the linoleum floor. "Ma'am," Blake said, his tone stern, "we got a report of suspicious activity in the area. Can you show us what's in your bag?" Michelle blinked, momentarily stunned. "Excuse me?" Hunter folded his arms. "You heard him. Open the bag." "I haven't stolen anything," Michelle said firmly, though her heartbeat quickened. She held up the water and granola bar. "I was just about to pay for these." Blake's eyes narrowed. "We're going to need you to step outside with us." "Step outside? For what reason?" "Ma'am, don't make this difficult," Hunter interjected, his smirk growing. "We're just doing our job. Now, let's go." Michelle took a steadying breath. "I'm a judge. Judge Michelle Carter. I can assure you, this is a misunderstanding." Blake chuckled, a low, disbelieving sound. "A judge, huh? You got any ID to prove that?" Michelle reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her wallet. She handed over her identification, watching as Blake scrutinized it. Hunter leaned over to glance at the ID as well. He let out a sharp laugh. "This is fake as hell. A judge? You've got to be kidding me." "It's not fake," Michelle said, her voice growing colder. "Call your supervisor if you don't believe me." Blake ignored her suggestion and tossed her ID back at her. "You know, people like you always have some story, don't you? People like me?" Michelle's eyebrows shot up. "What exactly do you mean by that?" "You know exactly what I mean," Hunter said, stepping closer. "Now! Either you come with us or we'll cuff you right here." Michelle stared at them, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of her upbringing in this moment. The lessons her parents had drilled into her about staying calm, keeping her hands visible, and never raising her voice. But this was beyond humiliating. "Fine," she said, her voice like ice. "Let's go." As they escorted her out of the store, Michelle noticed the growing crowd of onlookers gathering on the sidewalk. She kept her head high, refusing to show any sign of weakness, but inside, she felt a mix of anger and disbelief. Blake opened the back door of the patrol car and motioned for her to get in. "Watch your head," he said, his tone dripping with mock politeness. Michelle hesitated for a moment, then climbed in. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing in her ears. She glanced out the window, catching the eyes of a young black girl standing on the sidewalk with her mother. The girl looked up at her, confusion and fear written across her face. The ride to the precinct was silent, save for the crackle of the police radio. Michelle kept her hands folded in her lap, her mind already calculating the steps she'd need to take to address this injustice. When they arrived at the station, Blake and Hunter led her inside, their grips firm on her arms. She glanced around, noting the tired faces of officers typing at desks, the buzzing fluorescent lights, the faint smell of burnt coffee. "All right," Blake said, guiding her toward a bench. "Sit tight while we process you." "Process me for what?" Michelle asked, her composure starting to crack. "I haven't committed a crime." "Disturbing the peace," Hunter said with a smirk, "and maybe resisting arrest. We'll see." Michelle stared at him, her jaw tightening. "You're making a mistake. A serious mistake." Hunter leaned in, his face inches from hers. "You can keep saying that all you want, sweetheart. It doesn't change a thing." Michelle turned away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a response. She glanced around the station, noting the lack of urgency among the officers. It was clear they didn't see her as a priority, or perhaps they simply didn't care. Hours passed. No one offered her water, food, or even the decency of an explanation. Her attempts to speak to someone in charge were met with dismissive waves or curt replies. Finally, she spotted a familiar face, Angela Wallace, her best friend and a prominent civil rights attorney, striding into the precinct with fire in her eyes. "What the hell is going on here?" Angela demanded, her voice cutting through the room like a whip. Blake and Hunter exchanged a glance, but said nothing. "Don't look at each other. Look at me," Angela snapped. "You're holding Judge Michelle Carter in this station without cause. I want her released immediately, or I'll have a lawsuit on your desk by morning." Blake cleared his throat. Nam, we were just following protocol." "Protocol?" Angela cut him off, her voice rising. "Protocol is verifying someone's identity before dragging them down here like a criminal." Protocol is treating everyone with dignity, regardless of the color of their skin. Don't you dare lecture me on protocol. The room fell silent as Angela turned to Michelle, her expression softening. Are you all right? Michelle nodded, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her calm demeanor. Let's just get out of here. Angela turned back to Blake and Hunter, her gaze sharp. You'll be hearing from me. As they walked out of the station, Michelle felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But as she stepped into the cool evening air, she made a silent vow. This humiliation would not be in vain. This was just the beginning. The media storm started before Michelle had even unlocked her front door that night. She hadn't expected to become the center of attention so quickly, but it seemed word of her wrongful detention had spread like wildfire. By the time she stepped inside, her phone was vibrating incessantly on the kitchen counter. Text messages, missed calls, and emails flooded the screen. Angela, ever the proactive attorney, had wasted no time alerting the press. She had called in every favor she was owed, ensuring the story would make headlines before the police department could spin their version. Michelle wasn't sure whether to be grateful or exhausted. She stood by the window of her modest, well-kept home, watching the city lights glimmer in the distance. Her usually serene evening routine, a glass of wine, some jazz on the record player, felt alien now. All she could think about was the way those officers had looked at her, as if her words were worthless, her identity laughable. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. When she opened it, Angela stood on the other side, holding a stack of papers and looking like she was running on nothing but adrenaline. I need coffee, Angela announced, brushing past Michelle and heading straight for the kitchen. Black, strong, no sugar. And sit down, because we have a lot to talk about. Michelle closed the door, sighing as she followed her friend. Angela, I haven't even had time to breathe. Breathe later, Angela said, already rifling through her papers. Do you have any idea how big this is? They didn't just arrest a judge. They arrested you, Michelle. A black woman who grew up in one of the most underserved neighborhoods in Atlanta and worked her ass off to sit on the bench. This is systemic racism at its most blatant, and we're going to make them pay for it. Michelle poured herself a glass of water, her hands steady despite the turmoil brewing inside her. I'm not interested in revenge, Angela. I'm interested in change. Good, because change is exactly what we're going to force on them, Angela said, slapping the papers onto the kitchen table. I've already drafted a formal complaint to file with the department, but this needs to go further. Public hearings, press conferences, demands for policy reform. Hell, I want every officer in that precinct retrained or fired. Michelle sank into a chair, rubbing her temples. I appreciate your passion, but this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been treated like they don't matter. If we're going to do this, it has to be about the system, not just two officers. Angela leaned forward, her eyes blazing. You think I don't know that? This isn't my first case, Michelle. But those two officers, Blake and Hunter, they're the face of the problem. We take them down, and we send a message to every other cop who thinks they can get away with this. Michelle's phone buzzed again, and she glanced at the screen. Another journalist, another request for an interview. She ignored it and looked back at Angela. What if I don't want to be the face of this fight? What if I just want to go back to work and pretend this never happened? Angela's expression softened, but only slightly. Then you wouldn't be the Michelle Carter I know, the woman who spent her weekends tutoring kids in this very neighborhood, who gave speeches about justice and equality even when no one was listening. You've always been a fighter, Michelle. Don't stop now. Michelle exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. She knew Angela was right. Ignoring this wouldn't make it go away. If anything, it would make things worse, not just for her, but for everyone who looked like her. Fine, she said finally, but we do it my way. No smear campaigns, no theatrics. Just the truth. Angela grinned triumphant. Deal. The next morning, Michelle arrived at the courthouse early, as was her habit. The familiar sight of the grand marble steps and towering columns usually filled her with a sense of purpose. But today, they felt like a fortress she wasn't sure she could breach. She stepped inside, nodding politely at the security guards who greeted her with the usual deference. At least they still recognized her authority, unlike Blake and Hunter. Her courtroom was quiet, the air heavy with the smell of polished wood and old books. She ran her fingers along the edge of her bench, letting the cool surface ground her. This was her domain, her sanctuary. But even here, she couldn't escape the memories of the previous day. Judge Carter, a voice called from the doorway. She turned to see her clerk, Mia, standing hesitantly with a stack of files in her arms. The young woman looked nervous, her usual bright smile replaced with a furrowed brow. "Yes, Mia, I want to say I'm sorry about what happened," Mia said, stepping closer. "I saw the news this morning. It's awful what they did to you." Michelle managed a small smile. "Thank you, Mia, but this isn't just about me. It's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Mia nodded, setting the files down on the desk. "If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know." "Actually, there is," Michelle said, an idea forming in her mind. "I need you to pull every case we've handled in the last 5 years involving allegations of police misconduct. I want to see if there's a pattern." Mia's eyes widened. "That's going to be a lot of cases, Judge." "I know," Michelle said firmly, "but it needs to be done." As the day went on, Michelle threw herself into her work, using the steady rhythm of court proceedings to keep her mind focused. But the tension in the back of her mind never fully disappeared. By lunchtime, she couldn't avoid it any longer. She stepped into her chambers and opened her laptop, pulling up a search engine. "Deputy Michael Blake," she typed, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before hitting enter. The first few results were unremarkable. Social media profiles, mentions in local news stories about routine police work. But then she saw it. A lawsuit filed 3 years ago by a black man who had accused Blake of excessive force during a traffic stop. The case had been dismissed due to lack of evidence. Michelle's stomach churned as she scrolled further. Another complaint, this time from a Hispanic woman who claimed Blake had harassed her during a routine call to her apartment. That case, too, had gone nowhere. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. This wasn't just about her arrest. Blake and Hunter were part of a much larger problem, a system that protected officers like them at the expense of the people they were supposed to serve. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, she didn't ignore it. "Angela," she said as soon as she answered. "We need to talk." "About what?" Angela asked, her voice cautious. "Blake has a history," Michelle said, her tone grim. "A long one. And I'm willing to bet Hunter does too. If we're going to do this, we need to expose everything, not just what happened to me, but every case they've mishandled, every life they've disrupted." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Angela spoke. "I'll start digging, but you know this isn't going to be easy, right? The department will fight us every step of the way." Michelle's grip tightened on the phone. "Let them fight. I'm not backing down." As she hung up, Michelle felt a flicker of determination ignite inside her. This was bigger than her, bigger than 2 officers, even bigger than Atlanta. This was about justice, real justice. And she wasn't going to stop until she got it. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The gallery was packed, an unusual sight for a midweek hearing. Reporters lined the back row, their cameras discreetly tucked away for now, while the faces of activists and community leaders reflected a mix of hope and determination. Among them was John Legend, his presence amplifying the weight of the moment, and even Oprah Winfrey herself had sent a representative to observe the proceedings. At the center of it all, Michelle Carter sat behind the bench, her face composed and regal. Her black robe, a symbol of her authority, felt heavier than usual today. This wasn't just another case. This was personal. Deputy Michael Blake and Officer Travis Hunter were seated at the defense table, flanked by their legal counsel. Hunter sat stiffly, his jaw clenched. While Blake avoided eye contact altogether, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. They looked less like men of authority and more like schoolboys waiting for detention. The irony wasn't lost on Michelle. Just days ago, they looked at her with such disdain, so sure of their power over her. Now, the roles had been reversed, and they were the ones being scrutinized under the harsh light of justice. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Everyone stood as Michelle entered the room, but this time, the weight of their eyes felt different. There was respect, yes, but also an unspoken acknowledgement of the injustice she'd endured. She let it fuel her resolve as she took her seat. "You may be seated," she said, her voice steady. The prosecution began its opening arguments, painting a picture of systemic issues within the police department. The lawyer, a sharp and eloquent woman named Naomi Green, didn't hold back. "This case is not just about two officers who overstepped their authority," Naomi said, pacing the floor with purpose. "It's about a culture of impunity that has been allowed to fester within the Atlanta Police Department. Deputy Blake and Officer Hunter didn't act in a vacuum. They are products of a system that prioritizes protection over accountability." Michelle watched the jury closely, noting their reactions. Some nodded in agreement. Others remained impassive, their expressions unreadable. When the defense took its turn, the tone shifted. Blake and Hunter's lawyer, a graying man with a deep Southern drawl named Frank Dobson, leaned heavily on the narrative of doing their job. These men were following standard procedure, Dobson argued, his voice calm but firm. In a high-crime area, suspicion is a necessary tool. They acted on instinct and training, not malice. Michelle's eyes narrowed. It was a familiar argument, one that had been used countless times to excuse police misconduct. But today, it wouldn't go unchallenged. The first witness was called, a young black man named Darren Wilson, who had been one of Blake's prior victims. Darren took the stand with visible nerves, his hands gripping the edges of the seat. "Mr. Wilson," Naomi began, her tone gentle but firm. "Can you tell us about your encounter with Deputy Blake?" Darren nodded hesitantly. "It was about 3 years ago. I was driving home from work late at night, and he pulled me over. Said I had a broken taillight, but my taillights were fine. Then he started asking if I had drugs in the car, if I'd been drinking. I hadn't done anything wrong. Did he search your car?" "Yes," Darren said, his voice tightening. "He didn't ask for permission, just told me to get out and started going through everything. He didn't find anything, but he kept me there for over an hour. Made me late to pick up my daughter from the babysitter. Did you file a complaint?" "I did," Darren said, glancing nervously at Blake, who avoided his gaze. "But nothing happened. They said there wasn't enough evidence." Naomi nodded sympathetically. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson." When it was the defense's turn to cross-examine, Dobson took a different approach. "Mr. Wilson," he said, his tone almost condescending, "you say your taillights weren't broken, but isn't it possible you simply didn't notice? After all, you were driving at night." Darren hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I check my car regularly. I know they weren't broken." Dobson smirked. "And yet, here we are. No further questions." The tension in the room grew as more witnesses took the stand. Each story painted a damning picture of Blake and Hunter's behavior. Patterns of racial profiling, intimidation, and unwarranted detentions. Michelle listened intently, her expression giving away nothing, but inside, her anger simmered. Finally, the time came for the officers themselves to testify. Blake was called first. He walked to the stand with measured steps, his face carefully neutral. "Deputy Blake," Naomi began, her voice sharp. "Can you explain why you arrested Judge Carter on the morning in question?" Blake shifted in his seat. "We received a call about suspicious activity at a store. When we arrived, Judge Carter matched the description given by the caller. Suspicious activity?" Naomi raised an eyebrow. "You mean shopping?" Blake's jaw tightened. She refused to cooperate at first, which raised further suspicion. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. Did it ever occur to you to verify her identity before placing her under arrest? Blake hesitated, his discomfort evident. I thought her ID was fake. You thought, Naomi repeated, her tone biting. But you didn't verify. Isn't it true, Deputy Blake, that Judge Carter told you who she was multiple times? Blake glanced toward Hunter, who avoided his gaze. Yes, but no further questions, Naomi said, cutting him off. Hunter was next. His demeanor was markedly different, defensive, even defiant. Officer Hunter, Naomi began. Can you explain why you laughed when Judge Carter presented her identification? Hunter's smirk returned. Because it was ridiculous. A judge in that neighborhood? Dressed like that? Come on. The room erupted into murmurs, and Michelle's stomach twisted. This was exactly the kind of blatant bias she had spent her career fighting against. Ridiculous? Naomi's voice rose, her indignation palpable. So, in your professional opinion, people from certain neighborhoods can achieve positions of power? Hunter's smirk faltered. That's not what I meant, but that's what you said. Naomi shot back. No further questions. As Hunter stepped down, the tension in the room was palpable. The prosecution had made its case clear. Blake and Hunter weren't just flawed. They were products of a system that encouraged and enabled their behavior. Michelle adjourned the hearing for the day, her mind spinning as she left the bench. She knew the hardest part was yet to come. The jury's deliberation would be a turning point, not just for her, but for the entire community. As she stepped into her chambers, she found Angela waiting for her, a grim smile on her face. That was brutal, Angela said, handing Michelle a cup of tea. It needed to be, Michelle replied, sinking into her chair. Angela nodded. We're exposing them piece by piece. But you know this isn't just about these two. The whole system is on trial. I know, Michelle said softly, staring at the tea in her hands. And we can't afford to lose. The weight of that truth hung heavy in the room, but Michelle knew she couldn't back down. This was bigger than her. It always had been. The courtroom was quieter the next morning, but the tension was even heavier. By now, the story of Deputy Blake and Officer Hunter's wrongful arrest of Judge Michelle Carter had reached every corner of Atlanta and beyond. News outlets across the country had picked up the case, sparking heated debates about race, policing, and justice in America. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, their chants echoing through the marble halls. Inside the courtroom, Michelle adjusted her robe as she prepared to step back onto the bench. She felt the weight of the case more acutely today. This wasn't just about two men who had wronged her. It was about addressing the rot in the system that had allowed them to act with impunity. Angela had spent the evening with Michelle, going over the case files and evidence they gathered on Blake and Hunter. The more they dug, the more it became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. Blake alone had been named in 8 separate complaints over the past 5 years. Hunter, though newer to the force, had already been flagged twice for questionable conduct. And yet, nothing had ever come of it. This was the pattern Michelle had feared. A culture protecting officers at all costs, no matter the harm they caused. She stepped into the courtroom, her face unreadable, and called the session to order. The prosecution was ready to present their final pieces of evidence. Pieces that Michelle knew could be devastating for the defense. Naomi Green approached the bench with the confidence of someone who knew the cards were stacked in her favor. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call Captain Robert Hayes to the stand, she announced. The courtroom murmured in surprise. Captain Hayes was the commanding officer at the precinct where Blake and Hunter worked. His name had come up several times in the case, though until now, he had avoided direct scrutiny. When Hayes took the stand, he looked uncomfortable. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a sharp uniform, but his confident posture couldn't hide the nervous glint in his eyes. Captain Hayes, Naomi began, how long have you been with the Atlanta Police Department? 22 years, Hayes replied, his voice steady but guarded. And how long have you been the commanding officer of the precinct where Deputy Blake and Officer Hunter are assigned? 7 years. Naomi nodded. In those 7 years, how many complaints of misconduct have been filed against officers under your command? Hayes shifted in his seat. I don't have that exact number in front of me. Would you say it's more than 10? Naomi pressed. Hayes hesitated. Possibly more than 20? He sighed. Yes. And how many of those complaints resulted in disciplinary action? Hayes cleared his throat. A few, maybe 2 or 3. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, and Michelle banged her gavel for silence. Captain Hayes, Naomi continued, her voice sharp. Are you aware that Deputy Blake has been named in 8 separate complaints of misconduct, including excessive force and racial profiling? I am, Hayes admitted, and yet he remains on the force. Why? Hayes hesitated, his discomfort evident. Not all complaints are substantiated. We have a process for reviewing these claims, and if there's no concrete evidence, we can't take action. Naomi's eyes narrowed. And who oversees this review process? The Internal Affairs Division, Hayes replied. Isn't it true, Captain Hayes, that the Internal Affairs Division often relies on the testimony of other officers to determine the validity of a complaint? Yes, Hayes said reluctantly. And isn't it also true that officers rarely testify against their colleagues? Hayes didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. Yes. Naomi paused, letting the weight of his admission settle over the courtroom. No further questions, Your Honor, she said, returning to her seat. Michelle watched Hayes step down, his shoulders slumped. She could see the cracks forming in the defense's case. But she also knew this wasn't just about exposing 2 bad officers or even a negligent captain. It was about forcing a reckoning within the entire department. The defense called their own witnesses, but their arguments felt weaker by the day. Dobson tried to paint Blake and Hunter as hard-working officers who had been caught in an unfortunate misunderstanding, but the evidence against them was too overwhelming. It was the final piece of evidence, however, that sealed their fate. Your Honor, Naomi said as she rose from her seat, the prosecution would like to submit video footage from the body cameras worn by Deputy Blake and Officer Hunter on the day of Judge Carter's arrest. Michelle's pulse quickened. She had seen the footage already. It had been sent to her anonymously 2 days earlier, and she'd handed it over to Naomi immediately. But seeing it play out in the courtroom was something else entirely. The footage began with Blake and Hunter arriving at the convenience store. Their conversation as they exited the car was caught on audio. Another call about a suspicious black person, Hunter said, his tone mocking. What else is new? Blake chuckled. Bet she's just another one of those welfare queens trying to hustle free stuff. Michelle felt her stomach churn, but she kept her face neutral as the video continued. The footage showed their interaction with Michelle in painful detail. Her calm demeanor, her repeated attempts to explain who she was, and their blatant dismissal of her words. She says she's a judge, Hunter said at one point, laughing. Yeah, and I'm the damn president. The video ended with Michelle being handcuffed and escorted out of the store, her head held high even as customers stared in confusion and disbelief. The courtroom was silent as the screen went dark. Naomi turned to the jury. This is the reality of policing in our country, she said, her voice filled with emotion. A system where assumptions and prejudice override facts and human decency. Judge Carter's arrest wasn't just a mistake. It was a symptom of a much larger disease. And it's time we start holding people accountable. Dobson stood to cross-examine, but it was clear his confidence had been shaken. His questions were weak, his arguments half-hearted. When the day's proceedings ended, Michelle retreated to her chambers, feeling the full weight of the day pressing down on her. Angela was waiting for her, as always, with a look of cautious optimism. They're crumbling, Angela said, sitting across from Michelle. They are, Michelle agreed. But this isn't just about winning the case. It's about what happens after. Angela nodded. You're right. But we have to take this one step at a time. And right now, we're winning. Michelle leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. The end was in sight, but the road ahead still felt long. This isn't just a fight for justice, she said softly. It's a fight for change. Angela smiled. And if anyone can win that fight, it's you. Michelle opened her eyes, a flicker of determination shining through her exhaustion. Tomorrow would be the final day of the trial, and the stakes couldn't be higher. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. And she wasn't going to stop until she saw it through to the end. The courtroom was filled to capacity on the final day of the trial. A line of protesters snaked around the courthouse steps outside, chanting for justice, their signs raised high in the chilly morning air. Inside, the tension was almost suffocating as everyone waited for the jury's verdict. Michelle Carter sat behind the bench, her black robe as immaculate as ever. But today, something in her felt different. She was no longer just a judge presiding over a case. She was a symbol, a voice for so many who had been silenced. The weight of it all was immense, but she refused to let it overwhelm her. Across the room, Deputy Michael Blake and Officer Travis Hunter sat at the defense table, their faces pale and tight with anxiety. The bravado they'd shown earlier in the trial had vanished. Now, they looked like men who understood the gravity of their actions and the consequences they were about to face. "Will the jury foreperson please rise?" the clerk announced, pulling everyone's attention to the front of the room. A middle-aged woman with a calm, measured demeanor stood, holding a piece of paper in her hands. In the matter of Deputy Michael Blake and Officer Travis Hunter, she began, "On the charge of wrongful arrest, we, the jury, find the defendants guilty." The words hung in the air for a moment, as if the room needed time to process them. Then the murmurs began, growing louder as reporters scrambled to write down their notes and spectators whispered to each other. Michelle banged her gavel. "Order in the court," she said firmly, though inside, she felt a rush of relief. Naomi Green stood, her expression triumphant. "Your Honor, the prosecution recommends immediate disciplinary action, as well as a full review of the Atlanta Police Department's policies and procedures." Dobson, the defense attorney, stood as well, though his posture was more resigned and defiant. "Your Honor, the defense asked for leniency in sentencing. My clients—" "Enough," Michelle said, cutting him off. Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. She turned her gaze to Blake and Hunter, who both shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "This case was never just about you," she began, her tone measured but powerful. "It was about a system that has allowed people like you to operate without accountability for far too long. Your actions weren't just a mistake. They were a betrayal of the public trust. And that betrayal has consequences." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Deputy Blake and Officer Hunter, I hereby sentence you both to immediate suspension without pay, pending termination. Furthermore, I am recommending that the Atlanta Police Department initiate a full independent review of its officers and their practices. This court will not tolerate prejudice disguised as protocol." The room erupted again, this time with applause from the gallery. Protesters outside could be heard cheering as word of the verdict spread. Blake and Hunter stared at the floor, their expressions hollow. For the first time, they seemed to grasp the magnitude of what they had done, not just to Michelle, but to the community they were sworn to serve. As the courtroom emptied, Michelle remained seated, watching the crowd disperse. Angela appeared by her side, a proud smile on her face. "You did it," Angela said softly. "We did it," Michelle corrected. Angela shook her head. "No, Michelle, this was you. You turned what could have been just another humiliating moment into something bigger, something that's going to matter for years to come." Michelle smiled faintly, but her thoughts were already elsewhere. The fight wasn't over. There were still policies to change, officers to train, and a community to rebuild. But for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. That evening, Michelle returned to the neighborhood where it had all started. She parked her car and stepped onto the cracked sidewalk, her heels clicking against the pavement. The convenience store where Blake and Hunter had arrested her was still open, its windows glowing softly in the fading light. Inside, the same young cashier who had called the police was restocking shelves. He froze when he saw Michelle, his face turning pale. "Judge Carter," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think you'd come back here. I didn't come to hold a grudge," Michelle said gently. "I came because I believe people can change, if they're willing to learn." The cashier swallowed hard, his eyes downcast. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have called them. I thought I was doing the right thing." Michelle studied him for a moment, then nodded. "The right thing starts with treating people with respect. Remember that." The young man nodded quickly, his shoulders slumping in relief. Michelle left the store and began walking down the street, the cold air biting at her skin. The mural on the side of the building caught her eye again, the faded image of the young black girl reading a book. She stopped, her chest tightening as she studied it. Tomorrow, she thought, she would make some calls. She knew a few local artists who could restore the mural, bring it back to life. The neighborhood deserved that much. As she walked back to her car, a young girl ran up to her, clutching a small notebook. "Judge Carter," the girl said, her eyes wide with excitement. "Can I ask you something?" Michelle crouched down, so they were eye level. "Of course. Are you going to put all the bad guys in jail?" Michelle smiled warmly. "I'll do my best. But sometimes it's not just about putting people in jail. It's about making sure the bad stuff doesn't happen in the first place." The girl seemed to think about this for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, I want to be like you when I grow up." Michelle felt a lump rise in her throat, but she kept her composure. "You can be anything you want to be," she said. "And don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The girl beamed and ran off, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. Michelle stood there for a moment, watching her go. The weight of the day began to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. The fight for justice was far from over, but today she had taken a step, a meaningful step, towards something better. And that, she thought, was a victory worth celebrating. As she drove away, the city lights shimmered in the distance, a reminder the work still to be done. But Michelle Carter wasn't afraid of the road ahead. She had faced humiliation, prejudice, and injustice, and she had turned it into something powerful. And she wasn't done yet.